Sometime during the intermezzo between Corona madness and Ukraine madness, Mrs. Whoopi Goldberg managed to stick a big foot in her mouth. I don't know how she did it. I guess it takes a heck of a foot to get stuck in there, but nonetheless she did. And of course immediately the entire interwebs.com ignited and erupted in a frenzy and a flurry of condemnation and indignation. The critics, generally speaking, focused on one of two aspects. The first was that it's unfair that she said something that had she been on the right would have earned her an immediate ban and much more severe consequences than what they actually had, which is a true observation. And there were other people who said that what she said was factually wrong and false. So let's examine that aspect. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously she expressed this in a little bit more primitive way, to say the least. She claimed that the Holocaust was not perpetrated or committed because of racism, but because of the evil inherent in man. So let's examine that. Let's take a look at Nazism in a broader historic perspective. It's typically framed in its immediate period and the times, but if we look at it for an extended historic period, we will see that since the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century, Europe was going through a lot of changes. We of course know about the Industrial Revolution, which itself was in large part due to the proliferation of education, the easier access to education by the masses, information in general, literacy, and scientific thought was of course very much the order of the day. It was very much in vogue. So the entire mentality, the atmosphere of the culture in Western Europe was shifting towards respect and acceptance of scientific theories, and many scientific theories were being advanced. Not the least of them, of course, the theory of evolution, Darwinism, ideas such as survival of the fittest. And so, of course, in that context, it was a lot easier to sell something under the pretense of science. Follow the science, right? We know this from many other places. So, of course, any new ideology that was going to be sold was would do well to frame itself in a scientific background or a scientific frame. And so that's how Nazi ideology worked. And of course the idea of racial hierarchy, certain races, so to speak, were either superior or inferior to others, was much more easily sold than let's just say putting it in different causes. So obviously Nazism was based in large part on this. Let's take a look at Nazism not so much from its own ideology perspective, but from the framework, the operational framework, the business model, if you will, the modus operandi. The Nazis began by convincing the masses and the people about their great love and concern for them, how much they cared about them, how much they cared about the fatherland, the German nation, German culture, Europe as a whole, European culture, European art, and so on. And so they were convinced, they succeeded in convincing the masses that they love them and care for them and have concern for them. Hand in hand with this comes the idea that the Germans in particular, and of course the white so-called race, was under attack, was being oppressed, was being downtrodden, was being taken advantage of by evil people. And of course, with this has to come a perennial scapegoat and someone who is the source of all of your troubles and misery. And you want to convince your audience that once they accept your new ideology to replace the old ways of the world, the old state of affairs, the new ideology will bring a utopian paradise, a solution to all your problems, wealth, health, and prosperity. And of course, they had to bring a new ideology to replace the old ways and to be accepted by the masses. And of course, with that came a strong charismatic leader, sort of a messianic leader. And from this perspective, Nazism is really no different than most other European dictatorships, totalitarian regimes. From this perspective, in fact, from practically any perspective, communism is no different than Nazism. They did exactly the same thing. They convinced and propagandized the masses that they're being downtrodden and oppressed by the gentry and the rich people, and that they are victims and how much they love them and care for them. And of course, in return for their acceptance of the new ideology, they gain moral superiority over the gentry and the bourgeoisie, and they're allowed to exterminate them. And of course, the new ideology itself came to replace the old state of affairs, and we had these quasi-messianic leaders or strong charismatic leaders, first Lenin, then Stalin. Same exact framework as Nazism. And the French Revolution also worked on the same premise. In the beginning, there was a totalitarian, terrifying, brutal regime. Luckily for Western Europe, at the end, it didn't work out like communism or Nazism. But in the beginning, there was a big period of terror and massacres and exterminations of dissidents. So there you have it. This is the so to speak, business model of Western totalitarian regimes. Let's take a look at Nazism relationship with its own dogmas or beliefs, or what they professed. Were they really consistent and logical with themselves? Did they truly believe their own racism? Nazis' principal ally during the war was Japan, who, according to the Nazi doctrine, is an inferior people, almost like the Jews themselves. So what gives? How are you going in being an ally of someone you believe has to be exterminated? So one may retort, of course, that the alliance with Japan came out of necessity. Politics, especially in wartime, make strange bedfellows and strange alliances, and it's very much possible that had things turned out otherwise, Hitler would have turned on his allies, the Japanese, just as he turned on his good friend Stalin. As a side note here, for those communist apologists who may feel inclined to claim that communism is somehow better or not as bad as Nazism, death camps, extermination camps were invented by the communists during communism. There were, of course, concentration camps already during the First World War, but they were not extermination camps. They were not fun, but the extermination camps, they were not. The first extermination camps were created and implemented by the communists before the Nazis did that. But again, this is just a small side note. So you may say that the alliance with the Japanese does not carry that much weight. Well, let's examine one of Hitler's closest allies, friends, confidentes, confidence men, was none other than Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was every bit as Semitic as myself. So what gives? How come he is not inferior? How come he is not being exterminated? Right? Quite a question mark here. As a side note, many believe, or at least claim, that al-Husseini was the one who prodded and instigated Hitler to carry out the Holocaust, using the Armenian genocide as an example, or as to show him that there are no consequences to genocide. 1.5 million Armenians were massacred during World War I by the Young Turks, the equivalent of the Turkish equivalent of the Brown Shirts or the SS, more or less. They went around and rounded up Armenians and slaughtered them, not as methodically and sadistically as the Nazis, but anyway, massacre is massacre. And so, according to many scholars, al-Husseini is the one who so encouraged Hitler to carry out the final solution. Have you ever heard of Sabbatarians, a type of Protestants who reproach themselves to the Old Testament and started observing the Sabbath on Saturday instead of Sunday? And this was rather popular in Transylvania until sometime in the 20s, an entire village of Sabbatarians converted to Judaism. This was a religious conversion from a quote-unquote racial perspective. They were purebred Aryans, nothing wrong with them, and yet they were all taken to the death camps. They were taken to Treblinka, if I'm not mistaken, and most of them exterminated. Again, not very consistent with Nazi dogma, right? The Bosniaks, who are also, according to the Nazi logic, should be inferior, were of course gladly accepted by the SS and Einsatzgruppen. In fact, they were among the most ferocious and sadistic perpetrator of massacres and tortures. They had a hobby, what's called eye harvest contests. They used to go in the camps, round up the Jews, and have competition who can carve out most eyes. One of their favorite hobbies was ripping out children out of their mother's arms and carving the child's eyes, and then to save the mother's the pain of seeing her eye, like her child like this, they would carve out her eyes in turn. Very, very beautiful and palatable hobby. Thank you, Bosniaks. As an aside, and the Croatians did pretty much the same thing. The Ustaše, they volunteered to do all of this. No one forced them to do this. As a matter of fact, many countries, Poland and Hungary notoriously gladly joined in the massacres. In fact, in Croatia, Bosnia, just like I mentioned, Ukraine, Lithuania, the population itself massacred the Jews on their own, voluntarily, and before even the Germans set foot in their country. I kind of fail to understand how that was due to racism. They were not exposed to years of Nazi propaganda in schools and universities and the media. They were not so advanced in sciences. They did have, of course, universities, but they were kind of behind the times. This scientific thought didn't have as far and as deep a reach as it had in Western Europe. So what gives? What prompted them to voluntarily commit these atrocities? It would be foolish to ignore 2,000 years of Christian history, the history of incitement by the church, the history of the Crusades, of the Inquisition, of the pogroms, of the expulsions, of the false accusations, the tortures and the massacres. And Nazism was just one more chapter, maybe the last or the most modernized chapter in the Christianity's incitement against the Jews. That's all that it was. It was a modernized step or chapter in Christianity. And in fact, if you think back about what we just mentioned about the operational framework, the modus operandi of Western dictatorships, the first ones to implement that were the Christians. Christianity is based in that, right? Unconditional love, endless compassion, convincing the populace of their downtrodden status and misery and oppression, and of course in the name of their moral superiority, which they gained by accepting the new ideology, the New Testament, and the new Messiah, they gain moral superiority and the right or even the obligation to exterminate the non-believers. That's exactly what the Holocaust was. And the modern successors to that ideology or that methodology are, of course, the left, the wokes, progressives, the current European and American media. They just took the role of the church. They have now a chokehold on communication, media, education, essentially public opinion. And they shift public opinion. They do not yet exterminate those who disagree with them, not because they're such good-hearted, but simply because they can't. They don't have the means yet. Today they can shut down someone's Twitter account or Facebook account. They can cause someone to lose their job. They cannot put them in death camps yet, but as soon as they'll be able to, they will do it. But be it as it may, we see that all dictatorships, at least in the West, work on this premise. Understandably, for modern Christians, this is a little bit difficult to stomach, especially since in modern times Christians haven't behaved in that way. In fact, many of them are pretty much targets of the left, and at least in the States, but also a lot of European Christians are being more friendly towards Jews and Israel. But nonetheless, history is history and facts are facts and truth is truth. So you can't change that. Try as you may. So there you have it. So Whoopi's critics are wrong. Whoopi Goldberg, and again, I don't suspect her of having enough brain cells to rub together to have consciously thought of this idea. Nonetheless, at least by chance or by mistake, she said the truth out of character, and pretty much the only time she said the truth, she's being banned from her own show. Poor Whoopi. Poor Whoopi. I feel so bad for her. Another interesting chapter in this little episode is that immediately afterwards, Jonathan Greenblatt of the Defamation League hurried to extend her an olive branch and to explain to her that, yes, the Holocaust was committed because of racism. One might ask, hey, you have here a golden opportunity to knock Christians and make them look bad. Wouldn't have that made more sense? But of course not. One of the biggest no-nos in the leftist doctrine is deviating from the narrative. The narrative has to be adhered to come what may. And the modern narrative is that once upon a time there was a bad man, Hitler, who woke up one day, invented racism, and in the racism exterminated millions of people. And this is the narrative that everybody has to follow. This is a very easy, primitive narrative. Of course, the main purpose here is that any opponent, anyone who disagrees with leftist ideology or leftist agendas is labeled a racist, and of course, by association, becomes sort of accomplice or at least similar to the perpetrators of the Holocaust. So it's very, very important to keep it at this. Of course, you have to keep it primitive and easily salable to the masses. There are many aspects to this, and it's very important not to reveal the direct connection between the Christian MO framework and the leftist framework. So they want to keep it simple, and to the point, and this is the narrative. We stick to racism. So before we leave, let's come back to what I mentioned in the beginning about Whoopi's choice of words. What she said almost verbatim is that the Holocaust was not about race. It was about the evil that men do. Grammatically, this doesn't make too much sense. What does it mean was about? The Holocaust was about? Was a movie? It's a book? It's a work of fiction? Is that what Whoopi is trying to insinuate? I don't think, again, that she has enough brain cells to have made this conscious connection, but nonetheless, these are her words. These are her exact words. She said it was not about. It's pretty prevalent on her neck of the political spectrum. We know that the Democrat Party is closely tied to Louis Farrakhan, and we have people like Ayanna Pressley and AOC and their friends, Rashida Tlaib, all of these people who are, of course, staunch Holocaust deniers, throwing the fact that people like Whoopi, who's, let's just say, for YouTube safety, whose exterior layer does not reflect light, they have the exclusive right on suffering and oppression. And so it has to be done in the name of racism. And they have to use very obfuscated and primitive language. And that has numerous benefits. It's an important weapon in the arsenal of the left to bastardize and dilute and defile language, the meaning of words, the meaning of speech, make it as shallow and low level as possible. It makes it easy to retroactively reshape your words. It's very common in the left to say, I didn't say what I just said 3 minutes ago, or easily being able to change the meaning of words, especially retroactively. But it's important for them that speech in and of itself should be meaningless and primitive. The modern educational model has brought the masses to a level that they can easily ingest information, but not digest it. And of course, with the left's chokehold on communication and media and education, they can very easily shape public opinion. But bastardizing language is a very, very important tool in the leftist arsenal. And of course, this is exactly what Whoopi was using, maybe not fully consciously, but semi-consciously, and this is what, of course, Greenblatt kept encouraging her to do. So there you have it, the Whoopi Goldberg controversy in a nutshell. And I hope to see you again another time with another topic. So long.